Well, thank you for the invitation again to Keenan and the team that put the day together. I want to start by saying there are a lot of URLs in this presentation that you might think you need to madly write down, but the presentation is available for download from this URL. So if you're thinking of taking notes, you can just write down this one link. You can download the slides later, and then you don't have to hastily take notes during the talk. So I'll leave that up there for just one more second before we go on. Okay, I want to begin by asking you to turn to the person next to you and discuss the similarities between these two pieces of art I have on the screen here. See if you can find some things that they have in common. Go ahead and call out a thing or two. What kinds of things do you see in common here? Faces, creativity, text, blue. Not really similar, but yeah. This is like the worst kind of exam, right? It's the guess what the teacher's thinking kind of exam. And actually, of the many things that these two pictures have in common, the thing I wanted to highlight just at the beginning of the talk today is that this $100 million, multiple hundreds of millions of dollars piece of art on the right and this piece of art on the left both enjoy equal copyright protection under the law. That's the position I wanted to start from today. So this is a talk about open educational resources, and so we ought to begin by defining some terms. Open as an adjective defining educational resources describes these artifacts. This is odd to give the talk, not being able to see my own slides. See if I can turn this around here a little bit. So for about a decade, we've used the term open in this way to describe nouns like textbooks, educational resources, courseware, even open source software. Maybe you've heard some of these terms. And if you were here last year for the talk, I apologize for going over a little territory a second time. But if I were to have to put a definition out for this word open, I would say that open in this context describes teaching materials that are freely shared. In other words, they're shared at no cost. They're shared for free, with permission for you to engage in what I call the 4R activities. Those 4 R's being you have permission to reuse the material, to take it, make copies of it, hand it out, give to people. Redistribute is this handing out part, being able to share it with a teacher down the hallway or with a friend, or post it on the internet for anyone else to download. The ability to revise, adapt, and improve these resources, and also the ability to take and combine them with other materials in a mosaic or some other kind of way to create brand new things. So when we talk about open educational resources, we're talking about resources that from a copyright perspective come with these permissions and that we receive at no cost whatsoever. Now, copyright, as you may know, is a little more restrictive than giving us permission to make copies willy-nilly and hand things out to people and change them to suit our needs. And so because this approach of open educational resources overrides default copyright, we have to use a license to tell people the permissions that they have. And I don't know, by show of hands, I'll ask you on the next slide, how many of you have heard of these Creative Commons licenses? But these are licenses that are provided by the group's home is at Stanford Law, but it involves people from Duke Law and Harvard Law that provide these Creative Commons licenses to us that make it easy for us to tell other people that they have these 4R permissions. So by show of hands, have you ever seen one of these buttons on the bottom of a web page before? Did you know that that's what these buttons meant? They meant that you have permission to download, to make copies, to give copies to other people, to change them in any way that you'd like to or need to use in your classroom. That's what these Creative Commons folks and the licenses that are represented by these buttons here are telling us we have permission to do. Now, I have a new number, but I don't have a new slide here. I just want to give you a sense of the scale of where this Creative Commons movement is going. This is in millions of items licensed on the internet. So around mid-2009, it was at 250 million. It's actually at about 350 million items right now, including photos, videos, audio bits, simulations, texts that you can download and use in this way without paying anything, with permission to make these 4R kinds of uses. So while nouns might differ between open educational resources or open textbooks or open courseware, the actions that operationalize this idea are really the same. So these are ideas of being generous or of sharing with others or being giving. And in some ways just about simply overcoming your inner 2-year-old, you know. The one that says, oh, I made this, it's mine, you can't have it, it's my secret sauce, I only want my students to really learn effectively. I've figured out the best way to do it. I don't want your students to see it because then they might learn like my students do if I shared what I make with you. And unfortunately, law and policy, copyright law just keeps getting stricter and stricter. Give us legal tools to yell mine more and more loudly and hit each other with bigger toys. And of course, looking around in society, we see that it's not uncommon for people to sue each other and generally behave selfishly, which is unfortunate. And it's really unfortunate that we as a group are not immune to this kind of thinking. In our schools and in our programs, you will see this feeling that, oh, I've really discovered the way to teach it. And it's like a trade secret in a major corporation, like, I figured out how to teach it and I don't want anybody else to see how to do it. Well, because why? What might happen? Other people might learn effectively if they got a chance to see that super secret way that you teach English that's so effective. Not picking on Kelly, you just came to mind because you were up here talking. So I talk quite a bit on this topic, and I talk in a lot of places about it, and I'm often asked, what is the role of openness in education? And I think this is an awful question, because it implies there might be a large role for openness, there might be a small role, or a kind of a negligible role, or a tertiary one, or something. But I want to suggest to you that really openness is the only means of doing education, if you think about being generous, being sharing, and being giving. Because if you're not sharing what you know, if you're not sharing some feedback, if you're not sharing part of yourself with your students, then I would argue that there's not any education happening if you're not sharing your skills and your know-how and sharing feedback. So in the spirit of definitions here a little further, I would say that education is really this relationship of sharing that we enter into with our students. We share some of what we know, we share some of the skills we have. They share their current understanding back with us. We share feedback with them, which helps them update their current understanding, and they share a view of that back with us. And it's really this communicative sharing kind of process that underlies education. If there's not that kind of sharing happening, there's no teaching happening, and there's certainly no learning happening. In fact, I would argue that educators, who we call successful educators, are the ones who share the most thoroughly. So if you share everything you were hoping to share with every one of the students in your classroom, then you're a great educator. If you only manage to share half of what you were hoping to with only half the students there, then you're not as good an educator as the person who shared much more thoroughly with everybody that was there. So I think that's an important point to make, and it relates to openness. Now, if you'll forgive me, I want to draw out what might be a kind of a nitpicky distinction, but I think it's actually really important for what we do in the independent study context. So expertise, or the things that we know, are non-rivalrous. In other words, an idea isn't something that we have to compete for access to. If I share an idea with Charles, I don't have to forget it in order to give it to him. I can give that idea to him without giving it away. You might know this quote by Jefferson, which is rather famous. He who receives ideas from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine. Oh, here I am reading a PowerPoint. I'm breaking rule number 3. As he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me. So for a very long time, we've understood that ideas or knowledge or expertise have this very special characteristic that they can be given and shared without being given away. You don't have to give up possession of an idea to share it with someone. And in some ways, it's a really good thing. I mean, if you think about the honeybee that stings one time and then dies, you know, like it's got one sting in it and then it's done. If you had to give away an idea in order to teach it, our tenure as teachers would be very short. Right? We'd sting one time and then we'd be done. We'd have to give up what we knew to share it with others, but it doesn't work that way. Now, expressions of our expertise, when I take what I know and I write it down in a book, that's a different matter. Right? To give a book to someone, I have to give it away. If Justin's got volume 5, if he's come into the office and pulled volume 5 off my shelf and I want to use it again, I can't use it until Justin brings it back to me, because expressions of the things we know that live outside of us, like on a printed page, are different in this very important way. A book is something we have to compete for access to. If Justin's got it, I can't have it unless I go rough him up and take it back.
You're never going to let me live that down.
Never, no. Again, just using you as a random example. Now, bringing this back around to the last 10 or 15 years, digital expressions of what we know are non-rivalrous. So as opposed to the newspaper that we might fight over in the morning, 1 million people can all read the same CNN.com homepage at the same time. Or 100 million people. This is a very, very important thing, I think, even though it seems like a very small detail. I think for our mission as educators who participate in independent study, it's really important for us to understand this distinction. Historically, the expressions of what we knew that we put outside of ourselves had to be competed for. When we capture these things in a digital format, millions of people can all use them at the same time. I think this is a very, very, very important advance, something that we don't fully appreciate yet. That we now, expertise, of course, we've always been able to give without giving away, but now we can give away the expressions of our expertise. We can give them without giving them away. And I want to draw out the implications of this turn a little bit in the talk here. So this gives us an unprecedented capacity to share, right? Before, when I had the book on my shelf, I could share it with one person at a time. Now, if I have an electronic book on the internet, I can share it with an essentially arbitrarily large number of people at the same time. We can share like we've never been able to share before, which means then that we can educate like we've never been able to before.